I was afraid of failing, until I realized I already survived worse. Some stories begin with triumph, others with tragedy. This one begins with a simple truth. We are all far braver than we remember, far stronger than we believe, and far more resilient than we dare to imagine. The woman whose voice you're about to hear discovered this not through philosophy or therapy, but through the raw, unvarnished act of looking back at her own footprints in the sand, and realizing she had walked through fire more times than she could count. My name is Imogen, and I spent 32 years of my life believing I was fragile. I know that sounds dramatic, but it's the truth. Every major decision felt like stepping onto thin ice. Every opportunity that required me to stretch beyond my comfort zone sent my anxiety spiraling into what-if scenarios that could fill novels. I had convinced myself that I was the sort of person who played it safe because I simply wasn't built for risk, for failure, for the messy business of actually living boldly. It wasn't until last Tuesday, a perfectly ordinary Tuesday that started with burnt toast and ended with everything I thought I knew about myself turned upside down, that I realized I'd been telling myself the wrong story entirely. Let me take you back to the beginning, or at least to the beginning of my awakening. I was sitting in my supervisor's office, the late afternoon sun casting long shadows across her cluttered desk, when she dropped what felt like a bombshell into my perfectly ordered world. The company was launching a new division. They wanted someone to head it up. Someone with my background, my attention to detail, and here's where she paused, studying my face. Untapped leadership potential. The position would mean relocating to Edinburgh. It would mean managing a team of 12. It would mean making decisions that could affect hundreds of jobs, thousands of pounds, the entire trajectory of this new venture. I can't, I heard myself say before she'd even finished explaining the details. I wouldn't be good at. What if I mess it up? She leaned back in her chair, and I'll never forget the way she looked at me. Not with disappointment or frustration, but with something that looked almost like concern. Imogen, she said quietly, do you remember when you started here? Course I remembered. 5 years ago, fresh from university. So nervous during my first week that I'd actually been sick in the ladies' loo twice. But I'd needed the job desperately. My student loans weren't going to pay themselves, and my tiny bedsit in South London cost more per month than my parents' mortgage. You were terrified then too, she continued. But you learned. You adapted. You became one of our most reliable project coordinators. Pause. What makes you think you can't do it again? I opened my mouth to give her my usual litany of reasons. I wasn't experienced enough, I wasn't confident enough, I wasn't leadership material, but something stopped me. Maybe it was the way the late afternoon light was slanting through her window, or maybe it was the sudden realization that I'd given these same excuses for 5 years running, but suddenly I couldn't remember why any of them were supposed to be true. I left her office that evening with a promise to think about it over the weekend. Think about it. As if I'd be able to think about anything else. I took the long way home, walking through Hyde Park as the sun set, trying to untangle the knot of anxiety that had taken up permanent residence in my chest. The thing is, I wanted the job. I wanted it more than I'd wanted anything in years. But wanting something and believing you deserve it, or more importantly, believing you won't completely cock it up, are two entirely different things. That night I did what I always do when I'm overwhelmed. I made a cup of tea, pulled on my oldest jumper, and sat cross-legged on my bed with my laptop, intending to make one of my famous pros and cons lists. But instead of opening a new document, I found myself clicking through old photos on my hard drive. There I was at university graduation, grinning despite the fact that I'd been convinced I was going to trip walking across the stage. There was the photo from my first day at work, looking pale but determined in a blazer that was slightly too big for me. A snapshot from the office Christmas party 2 years ago, when I'd managed the entire event coordination after our usual organizer had appendicitis. And then I saw it. A photo I'd completely forgotten about. Me at 17, muddy and exhausted but smiling, holding a certificate after completing a charity trek across the Yorkshire Dales. 25 miles in 2 days, camping rough, navigating with nothing but a map and compass because it was before smartphones were ubiquitous and the GPS had died. I stared at that photo for a long time, and slowly, other memories began surfacing. Not the polished, Instagram-worthy moments, but the messy, difficult, authentic ones that I'd somehow trained myself to forget. I remembered being 11 and having to give the eulogy at my grandmother's funeral because none of the adults could manage it without breaking down completely. I remembered the way my voice had shaken but held steady as I told 200 people about the woman who'd taught me to bake scones and never let me give up on anything, even when I was terrible at it. I remembered being 16 and my parents' marriage falling apart in spectacular fashion. The screaming matches, the solicitor's letters, the awful family meetings where they expected me to choose sides. I'd been the one shuttling between households, making sure my younger brother had clean uniforms for school, forging my mother's signature on permission slips when she was too depressed to get out of bed. I remembered being 22 and my first proper heartbreak. Not the gentle mutual parting of ways that makes for good stories, but the brutal, humiliating kind where you discover your boyfriend of 2 years has been shagging your flatmate for 6 months. I'd had to find a new place to live in 3 weeks in London, on a graduate salary that barely covered my tube pass. I remembered being 26 when my father had his heart attack. The phone call at 3 in the morning, the mad dash to the hospital, the weeks of uncertainty while he recovered. I'd taken leave from work, coordinated his care, managed his business affairs, and somehow kept my mother from having a complete nervous breakdown. And each time, every single time, I'd thought I couldn't handle it. I'd been convinced I wasn't strong enough, smart enough, capable enough. But I'd done it anyway because there hadn't been a choice. That was my first revelation. I had a track record of surviving things I'd been convinced would destroy me. But it wasn't until the next morning that the real epiphany hit. I woke up earlier than usual, my mind still churning over the job offer, and decided to go for a run. Not because I'm particularly athletic, I'm not, but because sometimes movement helps untangle thoughts that get knotted up in your head. I was about 3 miles in, huffing along the Thames path and questioning my life choices as usual, when I passed a woman sitting on a bench feeding ducks with her young daughter. The little girl couldn't have been more than 5, all Wellington boots and messy pigtails, and she was chattering away about how the ducks were probably cold in the water. "But they don't get cold, sweetheart," her mother explained patiently. "They're built for water. Their bodies know how to handle it. Even when it's scary looking," the little girl asked, pointing to where the Thames was choppy and dark. "Even then," her mother confirmed. "They're braver than they know." I nearly stopped running altogether. They're braver than they know. I thought about that phrase for the rest of my run, through my shower, over breakfast, during my entire morning routine. And suddenly I was thinking about resilience not as something you either have or don't have, but as something you build without realizing it, like muscle memory. Every challenge I'd faced, every crisis I'd navigated, every moment when I'd been terrified but done it anyway, they hadn't been separate, isolated incidents. They'd been training. Not the kind you sign up for willingly, but the kind that shapes you whether you're paying attention or not. I started making a different kind of list that morning. Not pros and cons, but a catalog of evidence. Evidence that I was not, in fact, the fragile creature I'd spent years believing myself to be. Evidence like, I had moved to London at 18 with nothing but 2 suitcases and a university place, terrified but determined. I'd navigated university bureaucracy, student services, academic challenges, and social anxiety well enough to graduate with honors. Evidence like, I had talked my way into my first job despite having no relevant experience, purely by convincing them that my willingness to learn counted for something. I'd mastered new software, navigated office politics, built relationships with difficult clients, and somehow become the person people came to when they needed something done properly. Evidence like, I had survived my parents' divorce without becoming bitter or cynical about relationships. I'd rebuilt my relationship with both of them separately, learning to love them as individuals rather than as a unit. Evidence like, I had recovered from heartbreak not by pretending it didn't hurt, but by learning to hurt well. I'd cried, raged, grieved, and then slowly, carefully, rebuilt my capacity for trust. Evidence like, I had been there for my father during the scariest time in our family's life. I'd made medical decisions, coordinated care, and somehow found the strength to be calm and competent when everyone else was falling apart. The pattern was unmistakable. I might start every challenge convinced I couldn't handle it, but I'd never actually failed to handle it. More than that, I'd often handled it better than I'd thought possible. I realized I'd been measuring myself against some imaginary standard of fearlessness, as if courage meant never being frightened. But looking back at my own life, I could see that courage was something else entirely. It was being frightened and doing it anyway. It was believing you might fail and trying anyway. It was knowing you were probably in over your head and learning to swim as you went. That afternoon I called my best friend Philippa. We'd known each other since university, and she had the enviable ability to cut through my overthinking with surgical precision. "I think I might take the job," I told her without preamble. "About bloody time," she said cheerfully. "What changed your mind?" I found myself telling her about the duck conversation, about the photos, about my impromptu life audit. As I talked, I realized I wasn't just convincing her. I was convincing myself. "You know what's funny?" she said when I'd finished. "I've watched you handle crisis after crisis for 15 years. The idea that you think you can't handle professional challenges is absolutely mental. But this is different," I started to protest. "How?" That stopped me short. How was it different? Because it involved leadership. I'd been leading my family through crises for years. Because it involved making important decisions. I'd been making those since I was 11 years old, standing at a podium delivering my grandmother's eulogy. Because it involved the possibility of public failure. I'd already survived plenty of that. "It's not different," I admitted. "I've just been telling myself it is." "Right," she said with characteristic bluntness. "So the question isn't whether you can do it. The question is whether you want to do it." And suddenly that seemed like a much easier question to answer. I spent the rest of that week paying attention to my own internal narrative in a way I'd never done before. Every time I caught myself thinking I can't or I'm not the sort of person who, I challenged it with evidence from my own life. I can't manage people. But I'd been managing family dynamics, client relationships, and project stakeholders for years. I'm not confident enough to lead. But I'd stood up at my grandmother's funeral, spoken at university presentations, negotiated with estate agents and bank managers and NHS administrators. I'm not resilient enough to handle the pressure. But I'd already handled unemployment, heartbreak, family illness, financial stress, and academic pressure. By Friday, I'd realized something that should have been obvious but felt revolutionary. I wasn't afraid of the job itself. I was afraid of admitting that I might actually be capable of doing it well. There's something almost perverse about the way we talk ourselves out of opportunities. We'll spend hours cataloging our inadequacies but barely minutes acknowledging our strengths. We'll remember every failure in vivid detail but somehow forget the dozens of times we've surprised ourselves with our own competence. I'd been doing this for years, maintaining a careful inventory of my limitations while somehow overlooking the fact that I'd consistently exceeded them. That Friday evening I walked back into my supervisor's office. "I'll take it," I said simply. She smiled, but she didn't look surprised. "What changed your mind?" "I realized I've been afraid of the wrong thing," I told her. "I thought I was afraid of failing. But actually, I think I've been afraid of succeeding." Success, I'd realized, would mean admitting that I was capable of more than I'd been willing to claim. It would mean updating my self-concept, letting go of the comfortable story of my own limitations. It would mean acknowledging that maybe, just maybe, I'd been selling myself short for years. The thing about growth is that it's often uncomfortable in ways you don't expect. It's one thing to push past external obstacles. It's another thing entirely to push past the stories you've been telling yourself about who you are and what you can handle. But here's what I learned during those few days of honest self-reflection. Your past is not just a collection of things that happened to you. It's also evidence of what you're capable of surviving, adapting to, learning from, and overcoming. I'd been treating my history like a burden. All those times I'd been scared, uncertain, overwhelmed. But it wasn't a burden. It was a resume. A portfolio of resilience I'd been building without even realizing it. The move to Edinburgh happened 6 months later. The job was everything I'd expected and nothing like I'd imagined. There were challenges I hadn't anticipated and successes I couldn't have predicted. I made mistakes, some small, some embarrassingly large, and I learned from them. I had moments of imposter syndrome and moments of genuine confidence. But most importantly, I stopped being surprised by my own competence. The team I inherited was skeptical at first. I was younger than most of them, less experienced in their specific area, and obviously nervous. But I'd learned something valuable during my week of self-examination. Authenticity is often more compelling than false confidence. I didn't pretend to know everything. I acknowledged when I was uncertain and asked for their expertise. I made it clear that I saw my role not as having all the answers, but as helping them find the right questions and clearing obstacles from their path. 6 months into the role, we launched our first major initiative 3 weeks ahead of schedule and 15% under budget. A year in, our division was being used as a case study for successful team integration. 18 months in, I was asked to present our model at a national conference. None of this happened because I suddenly became fearless. It happened because I learned to reframe fear as information rather than limitation. When I was nervous about public speaking, instead of thinking, I can't do this because I'm terrified, I thought, I'm nervous because this matters to me, and I've handled things that mattered before. When I had to make difficult decisions about budget cuts, instead of thinking, I'm not qualified to make choices that affect people's livelihoods, I thought, I've made difficult decisions under pressure before, and I can do it again. When I had to navigate conflict between team members, instead of thinking, I'm not good with confrontation, I thought, I've dealt with much more volatile personalities in my own family, and I found ways to make it work. The shift wasn't from fear to fearlessness. It was from fear as evidence of inability to fear as normal human response to challenge. I wish I could say this transformation was permanent and complete, that I never doubt myself anymore. But that wouldn't be honest. I still have moments of uncertainty, still catch myself defaulting to old patterns of self-doubt. The difference is that now I have a different relationship with those moments. Instead of taking them as gospel truth about my limitations, I treat them as old programming that needs updating. When that familiar voice starts up, you can't handle this, you're not qualified for this, you're going to mess this up, I've learned to respond with curiosity rather than belief. Is that true? Ask myself, what evidence do I have for that claim? Usually, when I actually examine the evidence, I find that my track record tells a different story than my anxiety does. This realization has changed more than just my professional life. I've started applying the same principle to other areas where I'd convinced myself I was limited. I'd always believed I was not good with money, but when I actually looked at my financial history, I realized I'd managed to put myself through university, support myself in one of the world's most expensive cities, build up an emergency fund, and help my parents during a difficult period. Maybe I wasn't Warren Buffett, but I wasn't financially incompetent either. I'd always believed I was not athletic, but when I reviewed the evidence, I remembered the charity trek, regular running, years of cycling to work, and the fact that I'd never actually failed to complete a physical challenge I'd set for myself. I'd always believed I was not good with confrontation, but my own history showed me standing up to estate agents, advocating for my father in medical settings, and having difficult but necessary conversations with family members. The pattern was always the same. I'd internalized a story about my limitations that wasn't actually supported by my own experience. This isn't to say I don't have genuine areas where I need improvement. You do. We all do. But there's a difference between acknowledging areas for growth and defining yourself by your perceived deficits. For years I'd been doing the latter. I'd been so focused on what I thought I couldn't do that I'd barely noticed what I actually could do. Now, 3 years into my role in Edinburgh, I've learned to approach challenges with a different question. Instead of, can I handle this? I ask, how have I handled similar challenges before? Instead of, am I qualified for this? I ask, what qualifies me for this that I might not be giving myself credit for? Instead of, what if I fail? I ask, what if I succeed? That last question in particular has been transformative. We spend so much time catastrophizing about failure that we rarely consider what success might look like or what it might require from us. Success, I've learned, often requires us to update our self-concept. It requires us to let go of comfortable stories about our limitations and embrace a more complex, more generous understanding of our own capabilities. This doesn't mean becoming arrogant or unrealistic about what you can achieve. It means being honest about what you've already achieved, even when those achievements came disguised as survival, adaptation, or simply showing up when things got difficult. Your past is not just your history. It's your evidence. Evidence of resilience, adaptability, learning capacity, and strength you might not even realize you possess. The woman who delivered her grandmother's eulogy at 11 has public speaking capabilities. The teenager who held her family together during a divorce has leadership skills. The young adult who rebuilt her life after betrayal has resilience and recovery abilities. The daughter who coordinated her father's medical care has crisis management experience. These aren't separate from professional or personal capabilities. They are professional and personal capabilities, just gained in unconventional settings. I think we do ourselves a disservice when we only count formal qualifications, official roles, and traditional achievements as evidence of our abilities. Some of the most valuable skills, emotional regulation under pressure, creative problem-solving with limited resources, persistence in the face of uncertainty, are often developed during the challenges we wouldn't wish on anyone but somehow manage to navigate. Looking back now, I realize that Tuesday afternoon in my supervisor's office wasn't really about a job offer. It was about a choice between two stories I could tell about myself. One story cast me as fragile, limited, likely to fail at anything challenging or important. The other story cast me as someone who had consistently risen to challenges, learned from difficulties, and demonstrated resilience in ways both large and small. Both stories were based on the same set of facts, my actual lived experience. The difference was which facts I chose to emphasize and how I chose to interpret them. I'd spent years emphasizing my fears and interpreting my challenges as evidence of weakness. But when I finally looked at the same experiences through a different lens, I saw something else entirely. A long history of competence, growth, and quiet strength. The job in Edinburgh was just the beginning. Once I learned to see my own capabilities more clearly, opportunities started appearing everywhere. Not because the world had changed, but because I had changed how I moved through it. When you stop seeing yourself as someone who can't handle challenging situations, you start recognizing that most of life's opportunities are, by definition, challenging situations. They're chances to grow, learn, contribute, and surprise yourself with what you're capable of achieving. I won't pretend this mindset shift was easy or instant. Changing your relationship with your own capabilities takes practice, especially when you've spent years reinforcing the opposite narrative. But it's been worth every uncomfortable moment of growth, every instance of pushing past familiar fears, every time I've had to update my understanding of who I am and what I can do. Because here's the thing about survival. It's not just about getting through difficult times. It's also about what those experiences teach you, what strengths they reveal, what capabilities they develop in you. I used to think my history of anxiety and uncertainty was proof that I wasn't cut out for leadership or challenge or risk. Now I understand that my history of being anxious and uncertain, and doing difficult things anyway, is actually proof of exactly the opposite. You are braver than you remember, stronger than you believe, and more resilient than you know. Your past isn't holding you back. It's been preparing you all along. But let me tell you about what happened when I truly started living from this place of acknowledged strength, because that's where the real transformation began. 2 years into my Edinburgh role, I received a phone call that would test everything I'd learned about my own resilience. My brother Jamie, the same little boy I'd protected during our parents' divorce, had been diagnosed with a rare autoimmune condition. The doctors were optimistic about treatment, but he'd need extensive care over the coming months, and our parents, now in their 70s, were struggling to coordinate everything. The old Imogen would have immediately spiraled into catastrophic thinking. What if I couldn't handle work and family responsibilities simultaneously? What if I made the wrong medical decisions? What if I let everyone down when they needed me most? But this new version of myself, the one who'd learned to trust her own track record, responded differently. My first thought wasn't about what I couldn't do. It was about what I'd already proven I could do. I'd coordinated Dad's care during his heart attack while maintaining my job performance. I'd managed complex work projects while supporting my mother through depression. I'd been the family anchor during crisis before, and I'd never actually dropped the ball. So instead of panicking, I made plans. I spoke with my team about adjusting my schedule to accommodate regular trips to London. I researched Jamie's condition thoroughly, creating spreadsheets of treatment options and specialist recommendations. I set up a shared family calendar so everyone could track appointments and medication schedules. I arranged for grocery deliveries to my parents' house and hired a cleaner to reduce their stress. What struck me wasn't just that I handled the logistics. I'd always been good at that. It was how I handled them. Without the constant undercurrent of self-doubt that used to accompany every crisis, I could focus entirely on solutions rather than wasting energy on worry about my own adequacy. My team noticed the difference too. During our weekly meeting, my colleague Duncan mentioned how impressed he was with my calm leadership during what he knew was a difficult personal time. "It's like you've developed this ability to separate urgent from merely important," he observed. "You're dealing with a family crisis, but you're still making clear decisions here. A few years ago, you would have been second-guessing every choice." He was right, though I hadn't consciously realized the shift. I had developed the ability to compartmentalize without disconnecting, to be present in each situation without carrying the anxiety of others into inappropriate spaces. This skill served me well when, 6 months later, our Edinburgh division faced its biggest challenge yet. The parent company was restructuring, and there were rumors that our entire department might be dissolved. Staff morale plummeted. People were updating their CVs and whispering about redundancies in the corridors. In previous years, I would have joined the whisper campaigns, probably would have started polishing my own CV just in case. But by now, I'd learned to distinguish between productive preparation and anxiety-driven catastrophizing. Instead of feeding the rumor mill, I requested a meeting with senior leadership. I walked into that conference room with a comprehensive presentation about our division's value, our projected growth, and our strategic importance to the company's future. I had data, testimonials from clients, and a 5-year expansion plan. But more than the presentation itself, it was my demeanor that made the difference. I wasn't pleading or defensive. I was confident, not arrogant, but genuinely confident in what we'd built and what we could continue to achieve. "We're not asking for charity," I told them. "We're presenting an investment opportunity. This division has consistently exceeded performance targets, client satisfaction ratings, and profitability projections. The question isn't whether you can afford to keep us. The question is whether you can afford to lose what we're building." 3 weeks later, not only was our division retained, but we were allocated additional resources for expansion. The senior leadership team specifically mentioned that my presentation had been impressively assured and demonstrated exactly the kind of strategic thinking they wanted to see more of throughout the organization. Sitting in my office afterward, I marveled at how different that meeting felt from every other high-stakes professional conversation I'd ever had. There was no imposter syndrome, no voice in my head cataloging all the ways I wasn't qualified to be in that room. There was just clarity about what needed to be communicated and confidence in my ability to communicate it effectively. This wasn't because I'd become a different person. It was because I'd finally learned to see myself accurately. The ripple effects of this shift extended far beyond my professional life. Around the same time, I made a decision that would have been unthinkable for the old Imogen. I decided to buy a house. Not a small flat or a starter property, but an actual house with a garden, in a neighborhood I loved, at a price that felt significant but manageable. For someone who used to agonize over purchasing decisions that cost more than £20, this represented a massive psychological shift. The old me would have spent months researching every possible thing that could go wrong with homeownership. I would have created elaborate spreadsheets comparing mortgage rates, insurance options, and local crime statistics. I would have convinced myself that I wasn't responsible enough for property maintenance or stable enough in my career to justify such a commitment. But I'd learned to distinguish between reasonable due diligence and paralysis by analysis. Yes, I researched mortgages and had the property surveyed. But I also trusted my own judgment about what I could afford and what kind of life I wanted to build. The house hunt itself became another exercise in acknowledging my own capabilities. When the estate agent assumed I'd need my father's advice on the financial aspects, I politely corrected her. When the solicitor seemed surprised that I was handling all the legal communications myself, I didn't apologize for being competent. Most importantly, when well-meaning friends and family members offered their opinions about whether I was ready for homeownership, I listened politely but made my own decisions based on my own assessment of my situation. Moving day was chaos, as moving days always are. But it was chaos I handled with a kind of amused competence that would have been impossible a few years earlier. When the removal company arrived 3 hours late, I adapted the timeline. When it turned out the previous owners had left the house in a much dirtier state than expected, I rolled up my sleeves and got on with it. When the internet installation was delayed and I needed to work from home, I figured out temporary solutions. Each small challenge was an opportunity to prove to myself again that I could handle whatever came up. Not because I was invulnerable or because nothing could go wrong, but because I developed confidence in my ability to solve problems as they arose. 6 months after moving in, I hosted my first dinner party. This might not sound significant, but for someone who used to avoid social gatherings for fear of not being interesting or organized enough, it represented another important milestone. I invited 8 people, colleagues, university friends, neighbors, and actually enjoyed planning the menu, preparing the food, and facilitating conversation between people who'd never met. When one guest arrived an hour early and another canceled last minute, I adapted smoothly. When the main course was slightly overcooked, I made a self-deprecating joke and opened another bottle of wine. What struck me most was how present I was during the evening. Instead of spending the entire time worried about whether everyone was having a good time or whether I'd forgotten something crucial, I was actually participating in the conversations, enjoying the company, taking pleasure in bringing people together. Philippa, who'd witnessed my years of social anxiety, pulled me aside while we were clearing dishes. "You know what's different about you," she said. "You've stopped performing yourself and started being yourself. It's like you've finally realized that who you actually are is perfectly adequate for whatever situation you're in." She was right, though I hadn't thought about it in quite those terms. I had stopped trying to be the version of myself I thought other people wanted and started being the version of myself I actually was. This shift became even more apparent when I started dating again. I'd been single for nearly 4 years, partly by choice and partly because I'd convinced myself I wasn't ready for a serious relationship. But as I'd grown more comfortable with myself, I'd begun to feel genuinely curious about sharing my life with someone else. The difference in how I approached dating was remarkable. Instead of crafting elaborate profiles designed to attract the maximum number of people, I wrote honestly about who I was and what I was looking for. Instead of saying yes to every invitation because I was grateful for the attention, I was selective about how I spent my time. When I met Harrison, a history professor with a devastating sense of humor and an impressive collection of vintage books, I didn't immediately start cataloging all the reasons why he might eventually lose interest in me. Instead, I focused on whether I was interested in him. Our first date was supposed to be drinks that lasted 2 hours but ended up being dinner that lasted 5. Our second date was a walk through the Royal Botanic Garden that turned into an impromptu picnic and philosophical discussion about the nature of beauty. By our third date, I realized I'd stopped analyzing every interaction for signs of impending rejection and started simply enjoying his company. "You're remarkably self-possessed," he told me after we'd been seeing each other for about 2 months. "Most people seem to be performing some version of themselves on dates, but you just seem to be actually yourself." It was the best compliment anyone had ever given me, and one that would have been impossible to receive honestly just a few years earlier. Our relationship developed with a kind of organic ease that felt entirely new to me. Not because it was without challenges or complications, but because I approached those challenges from a place of confidence rather than fear. When we had our first disagreement, about something utterly trivial, as first relationship arguments often are, I didn't immediately assume it meant we were incompatible. When he had to travel for a month-long research project, I didn't interpret it as a sign of waning interest. I'd learned to distinguish between normal relationship dynamics and genuine red flags, between temporary difficulties and fundamental incompatibilities. This skill proved invaluable when, 18 months into our relationship, we faced a real test. Harrison was offered a prestigious position at Oxford, an opportunity he'd been working toward for years but hadn't expected to materialize so soon. It would mean leaving Edinburgh, leaving the life he'd built there, and by extension, leaving me. The old Imogen would have immediately started catastrophizing. She would have assumed this meant the relationship was over, or alternatively, would have desperately tried to convince him to turn down the opportunity to stay with her. But I'd learned to sit with uncertainty without immediately rushing to resolve it. We had several long, honest conversations about what this opportunity meant for him, what our relationship meant to both of us, and what options might exist that we hadn't yet considered. It turned out that my own professional reputation had grown enough that I could potentially negotiate a transfer to our London office, or even work remotely with regular travel to Edinburgh. It also turned out that Harrison had been hoping I might consider relocating but hadn't wanted to pressure me to make such a significant change. The conversation that led to our decision was one of the most adult discussions I'd ever had about anything important. We talked honestly about our career priorities, our relationship goals, our financial considerations, and our individual needs for autonomy and connection. 6 months later, I was living in Oxford, working remotely with quarterly trips to Edinburgh, and discovering that I was capable of much more geographical and professional flexibility than I'd ever imagined. The transition wasn't seamless. Few major life changes are. There were moments of loneliness as I built new social connections, moments of professional anxiety as I navigated working relationships primarily through video calls, moments of relationship stress as Harrison and I learned to balance his demanding new role with our life together. But each challenge was met with the same approach I'd developed over the previous few years. Acknowledge the difficulty, assess my resources, make plans, and trust my ability to adapt as needed. One particularly difficult period came about 8 months after our move. Jamie's health took a turn for the worse, requiring more intensive treatment and more family coordination. Simultaneously, my Edinburgh team was struggling with a major client relationship, and my presence was urgently needed. Harrison was in the middle of his most stressful semester, and I was trying to establish myself in a new city while managing multiple personal and professional crises. In previous years, this confluence of challenges would have sent me into complete overwhelm. But I developed systems and perspectives that allowed me to navigate complexity without losing my equilibrium. I flew to London to spend a week with Jamie, working remotely while accompanying him to appointments and helping coordinate his care team. I scheduled daily video calls with my Edinburgh colleagues to troubleshoot the client situation. I arranged for a local Oxford friend to check on Harrison and make sure he was eating properly during his stressful period. Most importantly, I communicated clearly with everyone involved about what I could and couldn't manage, and I asked for help when I needed it. The old Imogen would have tried to handle everything perfectly and simultaneously, likely burning out in the process. The new Imogen distributed responsibilities appropriately and trusted other people to manage their parts competently. The client situation resolved successfully, Jamie's treatment progressed well, and Harrison got through his difficult semester with his sanity intact. But beyond the practical outcomes, what struck me was how manageable it all felt, even in the midst of genuine difficulty. This wasn't because the challenges were objectively easier, but because I developed confidence in my own resilience and resourcefulness. I knew I could handle whatever came up because I'd been handling whatever came up for years. Looking back now, 5 years after that initial conversation in my supervisor's office, I can see how each challenge built on the previous ones, creating a foundation of self-knowledge and capability that continues to serve me. The job in Edinburgh taught me that I was capable of professional leadership. Jamie's health crisis reinforced my crisis management abilities. The company restructuring demonstrated my strategic thinking skills. Buying the house proved my financial competence. Dating Harrison showed me I could navigate relationships from a place of strength rather than need. Each experience added another piece of evidence to the case for my own capability, making the next challenge feel less daunting and more like an opportunity for growth. These days, I rarely find myself paralyzed by the question, can I handle this? Because I've accumulated too much evidence that the answer is usually yes. Not because I'm invulnerable or because I never struggle, but because I've learned to trust my ability to figure things out as I go. This shift has changed not just how I approach my own life, but how I interact with other people who are struggling with self-doubt. When younger colleagues come to me with imposter syndrome or anxiety about taking on new responsibilities, I find myself asking them the same questions I learned to ask myself. What evidence do you have for the story you're telling yourself about your limitations? What challenges have you already navigated successfully? Almost invariably, they've overcome more than they realize, demonstrated more competence than they acknowledge, and shown more resilience than they give themselves credit for. The woman who's convinced she can't handle public speaking has been presenting to clients for 3 years. The man who thinks he's not leadership material has been informally mentoring new team members and coordinating project deliverables. The person who believes they're not qualified for promotion has been exceeding their current job requirements for months. We're all walking around with extensive evidence of our own capabilities, but somehow we've learned to discount that evidence in favor of stories about our limitations. I think this is particularly true for those of us who developed responsibility early, who learned to be competent in crisis, who figured out how to handle adult challenges before we felt ready. We tend to think of those experiences as just survival, not recognizing them as the development of genuine skills. But survival is a skill. Crisis management is a skill. Emotional regulation under pressure is a skill. Creative problem-solving with limited resources is a skill. Persistence in the face of uncertainty is a skill. These aren't consolation prizes for having a difficult past. They're valuable capabilities that serve you well in every area of life, once you learn to recognize and claim them. My story isn't unique in its particulars, but I think it might be universal in its deeper pattern. Most of us have survived more, learned more, and grown more than we acknowledge. Most of us are carrying around evidence of our own resilience while somehow remaining convinced of our own fragility. The transformation isn't about becoming fearless or invulnerable. It's about learning to see fear as information rather than limitation, about recognizing strength in places you've been trained to see weakness, about trusting your own track record more than your anxiety's predictions. It's about realizing that you've been braver, stronger, and more resilient than you knew all along. Your past isn't holding you back. It's been preparing you for whatever comes next. And whatever comes next, you're more ready for it than you think.